Imagine a world where no income tax exists, where monopolies operate freely, where one man can control 90% of an entire industry, where fortunes accumulate so rapidly that families go from poverty to unimaginable wealth in a single generation. That world existed, in America, less than 150 years ago. We call it the Gilded Age. An era when railroad barons, steel magnates, and oil tycoons built fortunes that dwarf most modern billionaires when adjusted for inflation. When Fifth Avenue in New York became lined with private palaces larger than European castles. When inequality reached levels America had never seen before and hasn't seen since. But here's what most people don't understand. The Gilded Age didn't just happen. It wasn't inevitable. Specific events, specific technologies, specific decisions created the conditions where such extreme wealth concentration became possible. This is the story of how it started, not the glamorous balls or the elaborate mansions. Those came later. This is about the dark, brutal, opportunistic beginning. The moment when America's economic rules changed forever. When a few men realized the game had shifted and moved fast enough to capture everything. We'll follow the forces that made it possible. A war that ended, a railroad that connected coasts, financial panics that destroyed some fortunes while building others, immigration waves that provided cheap labor, political corruption that removed obstacles, and most importantly, the complete absence of regulations that would have prevented any of it. If you're interested in how wealth actually gets built, how economic systems shift, and how America transformed from a nation of farmers into an industrial giant dominated by a few powerful families, you'll want to see this through to the end. Let's begin where the Gilded Age truly started, not in a mansion or a boardroom, but on a spring day in Virginia, when a war ended and a new kind of American economy became possible. Chapter 1. April 1865. The day America's future changed. The Civil War had lasted 4 years. Over 600,000 men were dead. The South was devastated, cities burned, infrastructure destroyed, the economy in ruins. The question facing America in April 1865 was simple and terrifying. Could the nation even survive? Robert E. Lee knew the answer before most. His army of Northern Virginia was starving. Supplies had stopped arriving. Men were deserting. Union forces surrounded him. On April 9, 1865, he rode to Appomattox Courthouse to meet Ulysses S. Grant. The surrender was brief and dignified. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers could keep their sidearms. Men who owned horses could take them for spring planting. No mass imprisonments, no executions. Just go home. The war was over. The news spread through telegraph lines. In Washington, in New York, and Philadelphia, people celebrated. The Union had survived. The nation would remain whole. Slavery was ending. The great moral struggle had been won, but something else had happened during those 4 years. Something that would matter more than anyone realized. The war had transformed the American economy in ways that made the Gilded Age possible. Before the war, America was a collection of regional economies. The North manufactured. The South grew cotton. The West was mostly empty. Transportation between regions was slow and expensive. Each area operated somewhat independently. There was no truly national market. The war changed that. Both sides needed to move troops and supplies quickly over long distances. This required railroads, lots of them. The North especially built extensive rail networks. By war's end, the North had over 20,000 miles of track. The infrastructure for a national economy existed. The war also proved that large organizations could coordinate complex operations. Armies of hundreds of thousands of men moved, supplied, and fought in coordinated campaigns. This required logistics, planning, and management on scales previously unimaginable. Men who'd managed these operations learned skills that would prove valuable in business. The federal government had grown dramatically. Before the war, the government was small and weak. During the war, it mobilized millions of men. It issued bonds. It printed currency. It coordinated industrial production. It proved that large-scale organization was possible. That government could accomplish things previously considered impossible. The war had also created winners and losers. The South was destroyed. Its economy collapsed. Its labor system ended with slavery's abolition. Recovery would take generations. Meanwhile, the North emerged stronger. Its factories had expanded to meet war demands. Its farms had prospered, feeding the army. Its financial systems had grown sophisticated, managing war bonds and currency. This created an enormous imbalance. The South had nothing. The North had everything. Capital, infrastructure, labor, markets, all concentrated in the northern states. This concentration would prove crucial for what came next. The war had also eliminated political opposition to northern economic interests. Before the war, southern politicians had blocked many northern proposals: high tariffs, railroad subsidies, banking regulations favorable to northern industry. With southern representatives gone during the war, these policies passed easily. By war's end, the federal government strongly favored northern industrial interests. Abraham Lincoln's assassination 5 days after Lee's surrender shocked the nation. Lincoln might have tempered what came next. He'd shown concern for both North and South. He'd talked about reconciliation, about binding up the nation's wounds. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was weaker, less able to resist the forces gathering momentum. The soldiers who'd fought were returning home. Hundreds of thousands of young men, accustomed to hardship, trained in organization, looking for opportunities. Many had seen parts of the country they'd never have visited otherwise. They'd learned skills, made connections, discovered ambitions. And crucially, they were returning to an economy with almost no regulations. No income tax existed, no antitrust laws, no labor laws, no safety requirements, no limits on working hours, no restrictions on child labor, no environmental regulations. Nothing prevented ambitious men from pursuing wealth by any means necessary. The banking system had been reformed during the war. National banks now existed. Currency was more uniform. Credit was easier to obtain for those with connections. The financial infrastructure for large-scale business operations was in place. The telegraph had spread during the war. News and information could travel instantly across the country. Stock prices, market conditions, business opportunities. Information that once took days or weeks to spread now arrived in minutes. This created advantages for those positioned to act quickly. Immigration was about to accelerate. The war had temporarily reduced the flow of people from Europe. But peace meant renewed immigration. Millions would soon arrive. They'd need work. They'd accept low wages. They'd provide the labor force that industrial expansion would require. Technology was advancing rapidly. The war had driven innovation in manufacturing, transportation, and communication. These advances would continue in peacetime, creating new industries and opportunities. Men who understood these technologies would have enormous advantages. Perhaps most importantly, values were shifting. Before the war, making money through business was respectable but not glorified. Land ownership and professional status mattered more than wealth. But the war had been expensive. It had required mobilizing economic resources on unprecedented scales. Success had gone to those who could organize production and finance effectively. Suddenly, business success seemed patriotic. The men who'd supplied the army, who'd managed logistics, who'd coordinated production, they were heroes. They'd helped win the war. That success could now be directed toward peacetime prosperity. Making money wasn't just acceptable. It was building the nation. The stage was set. Infrastructure existed. Political opposition was eliminated. Regulations were absent. Labor would soon be abundant. Technology was advancing. Financial systems were modern. Information flowed quickly. And most crucially, the men who would build the Gilded Age fortunes were watching, learning, preparing. They just needed one more piece, one technology that would connect everything, that would create a truly national market, that would make coordination across vast distances possible, That would allow businesses to operate on scales never before imagined. That technology was already under construction, racing from both coasts toward a meeting point in Utah. Within 4 years, it would be complete. And when it was, everything would change. The Civil War had ended, but the real transformation of America was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Railroad Revolution begins. Building a railroad across an entire continent seemed impossible. The distance was staggering, 1,700 miles from Omaha to Sacramento, through plains where no trees grew, over mountains 10,000 feet high, across deserts without water. The engineering challenges alone would have stopped most projects, but the economic opportunity was too massive to ignore. Whoever connected the coasts would control transportation for the entire western half of America. Freight rates, passenger fares, mail delivery, everything moving between east and west would flow through that line. The profits would be enormous. 2 companies took the challenge. The Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento, California. They'd meet somewhere in the middle. The company that laid the most track would control the most territory and earn the most subsidies. The federal government made it financially attractive. For every mile of track completed, the companies received land grants. Sections of territory on either side of the route, millions of acres. The companies could sell this land to settlers, generating revenue before a single train ran. The government also provided loans, bonds that could finance construction. Essentially free money. Construction began in 1863 during the conflict. Progress was slow initially. Labor was scarce, materials were expensive, the technical challenges were daunting. But after 1865, momentum built rapidly. The Central Pacific faced the harder job. They had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains immediately. This required tunnels, 15 of them. The longest stretched over 1,600 feet through solid granite. Workers used black powder and nitroglycerin. The explosions were dangerous. Progress measured in inches per day through the hardest rock. The labor force was mostly Chinese. Thousands of men recruited from California and brought from China specifically for this work. They were paid less than white workers, around $30 monthly. They worked longer hours. They took the most dangerous jobs, clearing paths along cliff faces, handling explosives, working through brutal winters at high altitude. The conditions killed many. Avalanches buried work camps. Explosions went wrong. Men fell from cliffs. Disease spread through crowded quarters. No one kept exact records of Chinese deaths. Estimates suggest hundreds died, possibly over 1,000. Their bodies were sometimes shipped back to China. Often they were just buried where they fell. The Union Pacific had different challenges. Flat terrain made construction faster, but supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Everything had to be hauled to the construction site. Rails, ties, spikes, food, equipment, workers. The logistics were massive. At peak, the company employed over 10,000 men. Many were Irish immigrants, recent arrivals to America who needed work. They were paid slightly better than the Chinese crews building from the West, though still poorly by any standard, around $35 to $40 monthly. The work was brutal. Laying track in summer heat, working through winters, living in temporary camps that moved forward as the line advanced. The Union Pacific also faced attacks. Native American tribes, watching their lands being carved up without consent, fought back. Cheyenne and Sioux warriors raided work camps. They tore up sections of track. They attacked supply trains. The company hired guards. Skirmishes were common. More workers died from these conflicts. The line was being built through territory that wasn't empty. It was being taken. Both companies raced. Federal subsidies were paid per mile of track. The more you built, the more you earned. This created incentive for speed over quality. Track was laid quickly, sometimes poorly. Bridges were hastily constructed. Grades were too steep, curves were too sharp, but the goal was forward progress, not perfection. Repairs could come later. The competition intensified as the companies approached each other. By 1869, both were working at furious pace. Some days the Union Pacific completed several miles. The Central Pacific, having crossed the mountains, now worked on flatter terrain and accelerated. They were racing toward the meeting point. Congress eventually designated Promontory Summit, Utah, as where the lines would join. On May 10, 1869, officials from both companies gathered, Leland Stanford representing the Central Pacific, Thomas Durant for the Union Pacific, workers, photographers, journalists, spectators who'd traveled to witness history. The ceremony was brief but symbolic. A golden spike would connect the rails. Stanford swung the hammer and missed. Durant tried and also missed. Eventually, workers drove the spike properly. Telegraph operators sent a message, one word, done. It traveled instantly to both coasts. Celebrations erupted in cities across America. The nation was connected. The immediate impact was transportation. What had taken 6 months by wagon now took 6 days by train. Passengers could cross the country in relative comfort. Freight could move efficiently. Mail delivery accelerated. The physical connection made the economic connection real. But the deeper impact was psychological. America suddenly felt smaller, more manageable. The vast distances that had separated east from west weren't barriers anymore. You could actually travel between them, see both coasts. The nation became real in ways it hadn't been before. For business, the implications were enormous. A national market now existed. Goods produced in one region could reach another region quickly. Cattle from western ranches could be shipped to eastern cities. Manufactured goods from eastern factories could reach western settlers. This created opportunities for companies that could operate at scale. Local producers couldn't compete with firms shipping from wherever production was cheapest. The project also created demand for supporting industries: steel for rails, lumber for ties, coal for fuel, telegraph lines along the tracks, stations, maintenance facilities. Towns sprouted along the route. Land granted to the companies was sold to settlers. Every aspect generated economic activity. And most importantly for what came next, the transcontinental line proved that massive infrastructure projects could succeed, that companies could coordinate operations across vast distances, that with enough capital and organization, seemingly impossible tasks became achievable. This lesson would shape everything that followed. Cornelius Vanderbilt watched closely. He'd made his fortune in shipping. But he understood that rail was the future. Transportation was where power and profit lived. Whoever controlled movement of goods and people controlled the economy. The transcontinental line had just demonstrated how valuable that control could be. Vanderbilt had already been buying rail companies in the East, small lines connecting cities. He was consolidating them into a network. The same principle the Transcontinental Project demonstrated, but applied to shorter distances with higher traffic density. Connect everything, control the routes, set the rates, the profits would follow. Andrew Carnegie was also paying attention. He'd worked for the Pennsylvania line. He understood what the Transcontinental Project required: massive amounts of steel rail, all wearing out and needing replacement. If you could produce steel efficiently, if you could control that supply, the boom would make you wealthy. Carnegie was already planning his move into steel production. John D. Rockefeller saw different opportunities. Rail companies needed to ship freight. Oil producers needed trains to reach markets. If you could negotiate favorable rates, if you could make deals the companies couldn't refuse, you could undercut competitors. Rockefeller was thinking about how to use transportation power to build his own oil empire. The Transcontinental Line had done more than connect coasts. It had demonstrated what was possible in the new American economy: large-scale operations, national reach, massive capital deployment, government support, immigrant labor working cheaply, indigenous people displaced without compensation. The Gilded Age formula was visible in that single project. Within a decade, track mileage would explode across America. The Transcontinental Line was just the beginning. Companies would race to build networks across every region. The competition would be fierce. The profits would be staggering. And the men who controlled transportation would become the richest in American history. The golden spike driven at Promontory Summit was more than a symbolic gesture. It was the starting gun for the Gilded Age, the moment when America's economic transformation became inevitable. When the conditions for extreme wealth concentration locked into place. The Civil War had created the opportunity. The transcontinental connection made it real, and the men who understood what it meant were already moving into position. Chapter 3: Cornelius Vanderbilt's Monopoly Machine. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing. Born in 1794 on Staten Island, his family was poor. His father operated a small ferry. Young Cornelius quit school at 11 to work on the boats. No education, no connections, no capital, just ambition and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. By age 16, he'd borrowed $100 from his mother. He bought a small sailboat and started his own ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan. He undercut competitors on price. He worked longer hours. He provided better service. Within a year, he'd repaid the loan and expanded his operation. The pattern was set. Find a transportation market. Enter it with lower prices. Drive competitors out. Raise prices once you controlled the route. Then move to the next market. Repeat. It was brutal, effective, and completely legal. Vanderbilt spent decades building a shipping empire. Steamboats on the Hudson River, coastal routes along the Atlantic, a line to California via Nicaragua during the gold rush. By the 1850s, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. The newspapers called him Commodore, a nickname he enjoyed. But shipping had limits. You were constrained by waterways. You faced weather delays. And increasingly, you faced competition from something faster. Rail. The Commodore watched the transcontinental project with intense interest. He understood what it meant. Transportation was being revolutionized. Whoever controlled rail networks would control commerce. Shipping would become secondary. The future was tracks, not boats. In the 1860s, while still running his shipping operations, Vanderbilt began buying rail companies, small lines connecting New York to nearby cities, the New York and Harlem, the Hudson River Line. He wasn't building new track. He was buying existing operations and consolidating them. The consolidation strategy was brilliant. Individual small lines were vulnerable. They competed against each other. They had limited reach. They charged inconsistent rates. But connected into a network, they became powerful. A passenger could travel from New York to Buffalo on Vanderbilt-controlled track the entire way. Freight could move efficiently without transferring between companies. This required control, not just ownership. Vanderbilt replaced management at companies he acquired. He installed his own people. He standardized operations. He negotiated exclusive deals with connecting lines. He made sure that traffic flowed through his network rather than competitors. The tactics were often questionable. He'd buy stock in a competitor, then manipulate the market to drive down the price. Once the company was weakened, he'd offer to buy it cheap. Management often had no choice. Sell to Vanderbilt or face bankruptcy. Most sold. He also bribed politicians. This wasn't unusual. Most businessmen did it, but Vanderbilt operated at scale. He needed favorable legislation, charters for his companies, permission to consolidate, blocking of competing proposals. That required buying state legislators and city officials. He did so systematically. One of his most famous moves involved the New York legislature. In 1868, lawmakers were considering a bill that would harm his interests. Vanderbilt went to Albany with a suitcase of cash. He reportedly spent over $1 million bribing legislators. The bill failed. His competitors were outraged. Vanderbilt didn't care. He'd won. By 1870, he controlled the New York Central System. This was the key line connecting New York City to the Great Lakes. Virtually all freight moving between the eastern seaboard and the Midwest traveled this route. Vanderbilt set the rates. If you wanted to ship goods, you paid what he demanded. There were no alternatives. The profits were staggering. The New York Central alone generated millions annually, and Vanderbilt owned the majority of stock. He'd spent decades accumulating wealth through shipping. Now, in his 70s, he was accumulating wealth even faster through rail. But the Commodore wasn't content with just controlling one network. He wanted more. He began expanding, buying lines that connected to the New York Central, building stations, upgrading track. He envisioned a system that would dominate the Northeast entirely. The competition tried fighting back. Other wealthy men controlled their own lines. They formed alliances. They cut rates to steal traffic. They bribed legislators too. The battles were fierce. But Vanderbilt had more resources and more experience. He usually won. His methods became the template others would follow. Buy or destroy competitors. Consolidate operations. Control politicians. Set prices as high as the market would bear. It was monopoly capitalism in its purest form. And in the 1870s, with almost no regulation, it was entirely legal. The Commodore's personality matched his business tactics. He was crude, blunt, often profane. He didn't pretend to be refined. He'd grown up poor and never forgot it. He viewed business as war. You destroyed enemies, or they destroyed you. Mercy was weakness. His personal life was complicated. He married twice, had 13 children, favored one son, William, over the others. He fought with his family constantly. Some of his children challenged him in court. He cut them out of his will. Family loyalty mattered less than business success. When Vanderbilt died in 1877, his fortune was estimated at over $100 million. In an era when skilled workers earned perhaps $500 annually, this was an incomprehensible sum, the largest American fortune to that point. Adjusted for the economy's size, it would be equivalent to hundreds of billions today. He left most of it to William, not divided among his children, not given to charity. Almost the entire fortune went to one son. This concentration was intentional. Vanderbilt believed dividing wealth weakened it. Better to keep it concentrated so it could continue growing. William Vanderbilt proved even better at multiplying the fortune than his father. He expanded the network further. He improved efficiency. He raised rates. Within a decade, he doubled what he inherited. The family that had started with nothing now dominated American transportation. But the Commodore's real legacy wasn't the money. It was the model. He demonstrated that extreme wealth concentration was possible, that you could start with nothing and die controlling a vital industry. That aggressive tactics, political corruption, and monopoly power could build fortunes beyond imagination. Other men were watching. Andrew Carnegie saw how consolidation worked. John D. Rockefeller observed the political manipulation. J.P. Morgan noted how controlling a vital resource let you set prices. They were all learning from the Commodore's example. Vanderbilt had also shown that America's lack of regulation created opportunities. In Europe, governments constrained monopolies. They chartered companies with strict terms. They regulated rates. They protected competitors. America did none of that. If you could build a monopoly, you could keep it. The only limit was how much you could control. The transcontinental line had connected the coasts, but Vanderbilt had shown how to profit from that connection. Control the routes. Eliminate competition. Set prices high. The formula was proven. The Gilded Age was underway. And the fortune the Commodore built would fund the mansions, the art collections, and the social ambitions that defined the era. One man, starting with a borrowed $100, had created an empire, and in doing so, he'd shown a generation of ambitious men exactly how to build their own. Chapter 4. The Year Everything Exploded. September 18th, 1873. A Thursday morning in New York. The banking house of J. Cook and Company closed its doors. The firm was one of America's largest and most respected. It had financed the Union during the Civil War. It had funded railroad construction across the North. Everyone assumed J. Cook was invincible. The closure shocked Wall Street. If J. Cook could fail, anyone could fail. Within hours, panic spread. Depositors rushed to other banks demanding their money. Stock prices plummeted. Trading on the New York Stock Exchange was suspended for 10 days, the first time that had ever happened. The Panic of 1873 had begun. It would trigger the longest depression in American history up to that point. 5 years of economic contraction. Businesses closing. Unemployment soaring. Poverty spreading. Over 18,000 companies would fail. Banks collapsed by the hundreds. For ordinary Americans, it was catastrophic. But for men like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, it was opportunity. The panic started with railroads. After the transcontinental line's completion in 1869, railroad fever had swept America. Companies raced to build new lines everywhere. The Northern Pacific across the Northern Tier, the Union Pacific extensions, dozens of smaller regional lines. Everyone wanted a piece of the railroad boom. The construction required massive capital, more than existed. So companies borrowed. They issued bonds. They promised investors huge returns. And for a while, it worked. Money flowed in. Track got laid. Towns appeared along the routes. The expansion seemed limitless. But many of these lines went nowhere profitable. They crossed empty territory. They connected towns that barely existed. They were built on speculation that settlers would follow, that businesses would develop, that traffic would materialize. Often it didn't. Jay Cook's firm had invested heavily in the Northern Pacific. The company was building across Dakota and Montana territories. Beautiful country. Almost no people. The construction costs were enormous. The revenue was minimal. Cook kept lending, assuming things would improve. They didn't. Eventually his firm ran out of money. When it closed, the entire house of cards collapsed. Other railroad companies defaulted on bonds. Investors who'd expected returns got nothing. Banks that had lent to these companies couldn't collect. Depositors who'd trusted these banks lost their savings. The panic spread through the financial system like fire through dry grass. For the next 5 years, the American economy contracted. Construction stopped. Factories closed. Unemployment in some cities reached 25%. Skilled workers who'd made decent wages found no work at all. Families that had been stable fell into poverty. Soup kitchens opened in major cities. Homeless encampments grew. Labor unrest followed. In 1877, railroad workers struck when companies cut wages. The Great Railroad Strike spread across the country. In Pittsburgh, militiamen fired on strikers, killing 20. Rioters burned railroad property in response. Federal troops were called in. It was the closest America had come to class warfare since the Civil War. But while workers suffered, some businessmen thrived. The panic destroyed weak companies and created bargains for strong ones. If you had cash when everyone else was desperate, you could buy assets for pennies on the dollar. Vanderbilt expanded during the Depression. Railroad companies in financial trouble sold out cheap. He acquired lines he'd wanted for years at fraction of their former value. His network grew larger. His control became tighter. The panic that destroyed others made him wealthier. Carnegie saw opportunity in chaos. Steel prices had collapsed. Struggling mills sold equipment and facilities far below replacement cost. Carnegie bought. He acquired the most modern technology. He brought in partners with cash. By the time the Depression ended, he'd positioned himself to dominate steel production. His timing was calculated. During depressions, construction stops. Demand for steel falls. Prices drop. Weak producers fail. But depressions don't last forever. When recovery comes, demand returns. The companies positioned to supply that demand make fortunes. Carnegie was positioning. He also kept his operations running. While competitors closed mills and fired workers, Carnegie kept producing. His costs were lower. His technology was better. He could survive low prices longer than others. When competitors failed, he bought their assets, their facilities, their customers, their market share. Rockefeller used similar tactics. The panic hurt oil companies. Refineries closed. Drillers went bankrupt. Rockefeller's Standard Oil had cash reserves. He offered to buy struggling competitors. Most accepted. They had no choice. Sell to Rockefeller or collapse completely. Standard Oil's market share grew dramatically during the Depression. Companies that might have competed were absorbed. By 1877, when the economy began recovering, Rockefeller controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. The panic had given him a near monopoly. The pattern repeated across industries. Strong companies with capital used the Depression to crush or acquire weaker competitors. The crisis accelerated concentration. Industries that had been competitive became dominated by a few large firms. This concentration had long-term effects. Once these men controlled their industries, they could set prices. They faced little competition. They could extract maximum profit. And that profit could be used to expand further or enter new markets. Success fed on success. The panic also taught these men valuable lessons about leverage. Debt destroyed companies during downturns. If you'd borrowed heavily and couldn't make payments, you failed. But if you'd accumulated cash and stayed liquid, downturns became opportunities. Carnegie especially took this lesson to heart. He became obsessive about maintaining cash reserves. For ordinary Americans, the Depression was disaster. For the robber barons, it was acceleration. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Workers who'd had stable employment lost everything. Meanwhile, industrialists acquired new assets and expanded their wealth. The political response was inadequate. Some called for government intervention, for regulation of railroads and banks, for protection of workers, but business interests blocked most reforms. Politicians who'd been bought stayed bought. The few regulations that passed were weak and poorly enforced. By 1878, the economy began recovering. Construction resumed, factories reopened, unemployment fell, but the business landscape had changed fundamentally. More concentrated, more controlled by fewer hands. The Depression had winnowed competitors and left the strongest firms dominant. Carnegie emerged positioned to become the steel king. Rockefeller controlled oil. Vanderbilt's heirs dominated Eastern Rail. These weren't just successful businesses. They were monopolies or near monopolies. And in an era with almost no antitrust enforcement, monopoly meant power to set terms. The Panic of 1873 is often seen as catastrophe, and for millions of Americans, it was. But for the men building Gilded Age fortunes, it was catalyst. It cleared away competitors. It created bargains. It proved that wealth could grow even during depressions if you had capital and ruthlessness. The lesson was clear. Economic crisis didn't have to hurt you. If you were positioned correctly, if you had resources, if you were willing to buy when others were desperate to sell, crisis became opportunity. The rich could get richer even while the poor got poorer. This dynamic would define the Gilded Age. Inequality wasn't just a side effect of industrial growth. It was accelerated by each economic cycle. Booms created fortunes. Busts concentrated them. And the lack of regulation meant nothing prevented this concentration from continuing. By 1880, as the Depression finally ended, the shape of the American economy was set. A few men controlled key industries. They faced little competition. They had government in their pockets. They possessed more wealth than anyone had thought possible just 20 years earlier. The foundation was laid. Now they just needed to display their wealth, to build monuments that would announce their success, to create a social system that would legitimize their position. That would come soon. But first, they had to consolidate their economic power further. And two men, Carnegie and Rockefeller, were about to show just how far that consolidation could go. Chapter 5. The Industrial Titans, Carnegie and Rockefeller. Two men, two industries, two completely different strategies, but the same result: unimaginable wealth and near total control. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller rose simultaneously in the 1870s and 80s. They knew each other. They watched each other. They competed for the title of richest man in America. But they built their empires using opposite methods. Carnegie was visible, loud, social. He wrote articles and gave speeches. He believed in what he called the gospel of wealth, the idea that rich men had a duty to give their money away. He was charming in person. People who met him often liked him. His business tactics were ruthless, but his public persona was friendly. Rockefeller was the opposite: quiet, private, deeply religious. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided publicity. He lived modestly despite his wealth. He gave away money too, enormous amounts, but did it quietly. Where Carnegie courted attention, Rockefeller shunned it. Their industries required different approaches. Steel was about production, about building mills that could produce more, faster, cheaper than anyone else. Carnegie's advantage came from efficiency, from vertical integration, from controlling every step from ore to finished rail. Oil was about control, about distribution and refining. Rockefeller didn't drill for oil, too risky. Wells were unpredictable. Instead, he controlled what happened after oil came out of the ground. He refined it, he shipped it, he sold it. His advantage came from monopolizing these steps. Carnegie's rise started after the Depression of 1873. He'd worked for railroads. He understood what they needed. Steel rail, lots of it. The Bessemer process, developed in the 1850s, could produce steel faster and cheaper than old methods. Carnegie built mills around Pittsburgh using this technology. The key was scale. A small mill using Bessemer process wasn't dramatically cheaper than traditional methods. But a huge mill, running constantly, achieved costs no competitor could match. Carnegie built huge mills. The Edgar Thomson Works, completed in 1875, was the largest steel facility in America. He drove his workers hard, 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, dangerous conditions. Men died in accidents regularly. Carnegie paid relatively well compared to other industries, but he demanded maximum output. Workers who couldn't keep pace were fired. His management philosophy was simple: drive costs down relentlessly. Every penny saved per ton of steel multiplied across millions of tons became enormous profit. He measured everything. He knew his costs better than competitors knew theirs. When rivals cut prices, Carnegie cut deeper. He could survive at prices that bankrupted others. But Carnegie's real advantage was vertical integration. He didn't just operate mills. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota. He bought coal mines in Pennsylvania. He bought ships to transport ore across the Great Lakes. He bought railroads to move materials to his mills. Every step that added cost, Carnegie brought in-house. This meant when ore prices rose, Carnegie didn't pay more. He mined his own. When shipping rates increased, Carnegie didn't care. He owned his ships. Competitors who depended on outside suppliers watched their costs rise while Carnegie's stayed level. During good times, this meant higher profits. During bad times, it meant survival. By 1885, Carnegie Steel was the largest steel producer in America. By 1890, it produced more steel than all of Britain. Carnegie himself was accumulating wealth at a rate never seen before. Tens of millions of dollars. Later, hundreds of millions. Rockefeller's path was different. He started with one oil refinery in Cleveland in 1870. The oil business was chaotic. Thousands of drillers competed. Prices fluctuated wildly. Refiners processed crude into kerosene for lamps. Distribution was fragmented. Rockefeller saw opportunity in the chaos. His insight was simple. Don't compete on drilling. Compete on refining and distribution. Oil had to be refined to be useful. Whoever controlled refining controlled the industry. Rockefeller set out to control refining. His tactic was brutal. He negotiated secret deals with railroads. In exchange for shipping all his oil on their lines, he got lower rates than competitors. Much lower. This let him undercut rivals on price. He'd sell kerosene below cost in markets where competitors operated. His larger operation could absorb losses. Smaller refiners couldn't. They either sold to Rockefeller or went bankrupt. When competitors sold, Rockefeller usually kept them running. He didn't want to destroy capacity. He wanted to own it. The former owners often stayed on as managers, but they worked for Standard Oil now. Their profits flowed to Rockefeller. This approach was called horizontal integration. Instead of controlling the supply chain like Carnegie, Rockefeller bought all the competitors at his level. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. It wasn't a monopoly legally, but functionally it was. The organization was brilliant. Rockefeller created a trust structure. Separate companies in different states, all controlled by Standard Oil trustees. This let him operate nationally while avoiding state-level regulation. It also made the monopoly harder to attack legally. Prosecutors couldn't easily target one entity when power was distributed across dozens of technically independent firms. Rockefeller's management style emphasized control and efficiency. He hired the best managers. He paid them well. He measured results obsessively. Refineries that didn't meet standards were closed. Workers who didn't perform were dismissed. Everything was optimized for profit. His personal life remained modest despite the wealth. He didn't build a mansion like the Vanderbilts. His home was large but not ostentatious. He attended Baptist church regularly. He taught Sunday school. He gave away 10% of his income from his first job onward. As his wealth grew, his giving grew proportionally. But his business tactics were merciless. Competitors who wouldn't sell faced coordinated attacks. Rockefeller would cut prices in their markets while maintaining them elsewhere. He'd pressure railroads to raise their shipping rates. He'd spread rumors about their financial stability. Most eventually gave up and sold. By 1885, both men had achieved what seemed impossible. Carnegie was producing steel on a scale that dwarfed all American competitors combined. Rockefeller had created a monopoly that controlled the entire oil industry from refining to distribution. They were the two richest men in America. Their personalities remained different. Carnegie enjoyed his wealth. He built a mansion. He traveled to Scotland regularly. He hosted dinners and talked philosophy. He wrote books. He cultivated relationships with politicians and intellectuals. He wanted to be liked and respected. Rockefeller avoided public attention. He let his managers deal with publicity. He focused on business and religion. His social circle was small. He didn't pursue status or fame. He seemed genuinely uninterested in what people thought of him beyond his immediate family and church. But both men shared crucial traits: total dedication to their businesses, willingness to destroy competitors, ability to think long-term. And most importantly, they operated in an era with essentially no regulation. They could do things that would be illegal decades later. Neither felt guilty about their tactics. Carnegie argued that competition benefited society by driving efficiency. The strong survived because they served customers better. The weak failed because they deserved to. This was natural selection applied to business. It was progress. Rockefeller believed he was bringing order to chaos. The early oil industry had been wasteful. Too many refiners, constant price wars, instability. Standard Oil brought stability. Customers got consistent products at predictable prices. That was good for everyone, even if it eliminated competitors. Both men would later face criticism. Muckraking journalists would expose their tactics. Politicians would call them robber barons. Trust-busting movements would target their monopolies. But in the 1880s, they were building. And the fortunes they accumulated would fund the next phase of the Gilded Age. Carnegie's wealth would build libraries, fund universities, endow foundations. Rockefeller's giving would create modern medical research institutions. But that philanthropy came later. First came the accumulation. The ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable accumulation of wealth on a scale America had never imagined possible. 2 men, 2 industries, 2 paths. But together, they demonstrated what was possible in post-Civil War America. With the right strategy, the right timing, and the complete absence of regulation, a single individual could control an entire industry, could accumulate more wealth than small nations, could reshape the American economy according to their vision. The industrial foundation of the Gilded Age was set. Now came the social structure, the mansions, the elaborate parties, the attempt to transform economic power into aristocratic legitimacy. That story was just beginning. Chapter 6: The Immigrant Army. The Gilded Age fortunes were built on a foundation most people never saw. Immigrants, millions of them, arriving from Europe, desperate for work, willing to accept wages that native-born Americans refused. Without this labor army, there would be no Gilded Age. Carnegie's steel mills needed workers. Rockefeller's refineries needed workers. The railroads, the factories, the mines, all required more labor than America's existing population could supply. Immigration solved that problem. The numbers tell the story. Between 1870 and 1890, over 10 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Most came from Europe, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, Sweden, Norway. They arrived poor. They needed work immediately. They had no bargaining power. This desperation created opportunity for employers. When workers have nowhere else to go, When they're competing against thousands of others for the same jobs, wages stay low, very low. A steel worker in the 1880s might earn $12 for a 72-hour work week. That's about 17 cents per hour, barely enough to survive. The conditions were brutal. Steel mills were hot, dangerous. Men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Accidents were common. Molten metal splashed. Machinery crushed limbs. Exhausted workers made mistakes that killed them. There was no workers' compensation. No safety regulations. If you got hurt, you were fired. If you died, your family got nothing. Coal mines were worse. Deep underground, poorly ventilated, always at risk of collapse or explosion. Miners worked in darkness, breathing coal dust that destroyed their lungs. They were paid by the ton of coal extracted, creating incentive to work faster and take risks. Cave-ins killed regularly. Explosions could kill dozens at once. Children worked too. Factory jobs didn't require strength, just small fingers for detailed work. Textile mills employed children as young as 8 or 9. They worked the same long hours as adults but were paid a fraction of adult wages. Many were injured by machinery. Some died. It was cheaper to hire a new child than to make factories safer. The immigrants lived in conditions that shocked observers. Tenement buildings in New York, Boston, Philadelphia housed families in single rooms. No running water, no indoor toilets, garbage piled in streets. Disease spread rapidly: tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid. The death rate in immigrant neighborhoods far exceeded that in wealthier areas. Multiple families might share one apartment. A bedroom would hold parents and children. The living room would be rented to another family. The kitchen might house a third. Privacy didn't exist. Sanitation was primitive. The smell was overwhelming. But rent in these tenements was all immigrants could afford. The ethnic communities formed out of necessity. Irish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods. People clustered with others who spoke their language, who shared their religion, who could help them navigate this new country. These communities provided support that American society didn't. Churches and synagogues became centers of immigrant life. They offered more than religion. They provided social services, help finding work, assistance with English, child care, food for struggling families. These institutions filled gaps that government ignored. Employers exploited ethnic divisions deliberately. They'd hire workers from different groups and pit them against each other. If Irish workers demanded higher wages, bring in Italians willing to work cheaper. If Poles organized, hire Hungarians. The constant competition kept wages depressed and prevented unified labor action. Language barriers made organization difficult. A factory might employ workers speaking 10 different languages. They couldn't communicate effectively. They couldn't coordinate demands. Employers preferred this confusion. It prevented solidarity. The work itself was often seasonal. Construction happened in warm months. Many workers had no jobs in winter. They'd saved nothing because wages were too low. They'd face months of unemployment. Some returned to Europe during American winters. Others simply suffered. Women worked too, though their options were limited. Domestic service was common. Young immigrant women became maids, cooks, laundresses in wealthy homes. The pay was terrible but included room and board. For a family struggling to feed everyone, having a daughter living elsewhere helped. Many sent money home to support parents or siblings. Garment factories employed women extensively. Sewing didn't require English proficiency. The work could be learned quickly. Pay was calculated per piece, not per hour. Fast workers earned barely enough to survive. Slow workers earned less. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, though after our period, showed how dangerous these conditions were. Workers were locked in during shifts to prevent theft. When fire broke out, they couldn't escape. 146 died. The Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced additional discrimination. California specifically targeted them with discriminatory laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country entirely. Existing Chinese immigrants faced violence and forced relocation. The message was clear. Some immigrants were acceptable, others weren't. But despite the hardship, immigrants kept coming. Because as terrible as conditions were in America, they were often better than what they'd left. Ireland had suffered famine. Italy had poverty and political instability. Eastern Europe had pogroms against Jews. Russia had economic collapse. For many, America represented hope even if the reality was grim. The children of immigrants often did better than their parents. They learned English in schools. They understood American culture. They could pursue opportunities their parents couldn't. This mobility was real but slow. Most second-generation immigrants still worked manual labor, but some found their way into skilled trades. A few became small business owners. For the robber barons, this labor pool was perfect, abundant, desperate, divided by language and ethnicity, willing to work for wages that made enormous profits possible. Carnegie's mills couldn't have operated profitably, paying American-born workers what they demanded. But with immigrant labor accepting less, the margins were huge. The industrialists didn't see exploitation. They saw opportunity. They were providing jobs to people who had none. Yes, the wages were low and conditions were dangerous. But that wasn't their problem. Workers were free to quit if they didn't like the terms. That's how the free market worked. This attitude was widespread among the wealthy. Poverty was seen as personal failure. If you were poor, you hadn't worked hard enough. If conditions were bad, find better employment. The idea that structural factors might trap people in poverty was rejected. Success or failure was individual responsibility. Some immigrants did succeed spectacularly. Andrew Carnegie himself had been an immigrant, arriving from Scotland as a child. His success story became proof that anyone could rise, that America was the land of opportunity. But Carnegie's path was exceptional, not typical. Most immigrants lived and died in poverty. By 1890, the pattern was established. Waves of immigrants arrived. They took whatever work existed at whatever wages were offered. They lived in crowded, unhealthy conditions. They worked themselves to exhaustion. A few rose. Most didn't. But their labor built the industries that made others fabulously wealthy. The immigrant contribution to the Gilded Age is often overlooked. The history focuses on Carnegie's business genius, on Rockefeller's organizational brilliance, on Vanderbilt's monopolistic tactics. But behind every fortune was an army of workers whose names nobody recorded, who received almost nothing for labor that created everything. The mansions on Fifth Avenue required immigrant workers to build them. The steel for railroads came from mills worked by immigrants. The oil that Rockefeller refined flowed through refineries staffed by immigrants. The wealth displayed so ostentatiously was extracted from people who could barely survive. This wasn't unique to America. Industrial revolutions everywhere exploited vulnerable workers. But America's version had particular characteristics. The ethnic diversity. The complete absence of labor protection. The ideology that blamed poverty on personal failure rather than systemic exploitation. The immigrants themselves had little choice. They'd come seeking better lives. They found brutal work, but it was work. They sent money to families back home. They endured because endurance was the only option. And their children, they hoped, would have better chances. That hope was sometimes fulfilled, but the immediate reality was harsh. The Gilded Age gleamed for the few. For the many who built it, it was simply survival. One day at a time, one shift at a time, until injury, illness, or exhaustion ended their productivity. Then they were discarded and replaced by the next wave of desperate people seeking the American dream. Chapter 7. The Invention of Modern Corruption. Politics in the Gilded Age was for sale. Not secretly, not quietly, openly. Everyone knew it. If you wanted favorable legislation, you bought it. If you needed a charter for your company, you bribed the right officials. If competitors were getting advantages, you purchased better connections. The system was so corrupt that corruption became normal, expected, the price of doing business, and those who operated it became wealthy in their own right, though nothing compared to the industrialists who funded them. New York's Tammany Hall perfected the model. It was technically the Democratic Party's machine in Manhattan, but really it was a business, a highly profitable business that happened to involve elections and government. William McGeer Tweed ran Tammany Hall from the late 1860s until 1871. Boss Tweed, as everyone called him, understood a simple principle: control the government, and you could extract money from everyone who needed government. Contractors wanted city contracts, pay Tweed. Businesses wanted favorable regulations, pay Tweed. Immigrants wanted citizenship papers, pay Tweed. The amounts were staggering. Between 1865 and 1871, Tweed and his associates stole between $30 and $200 million from New York City. The exact figure was never determined because records were falsified, but even the low estimate equals billions in today's money. The methods were straightforward. The city needed a courthouse. Tweed's allies got the construction contract. They submitted bills inflated by 10 times actual cost. A plasterer might charge for 1 day of work and bill for 100. Lumber worth $1,000 was invoiced at $50,000. The city paid. Tweed and his circle split the excess. Judges were purchased. They ruled in favor of whoever compensated them. Laws were written to benefit specific companies. Tax assessments were adjusted for a price. Building inspectors ignored violations if properly rewarded. Police looked away from illegal operations that provided protection money. Every level of government was compromised. The immigrant communities Tammany Hall controlled accepted this arrangement. Yes, the machine was corrupt, but it also provided services: jobs for unemployed men, food baskets for struggling families, help navigating American bureaucracy. When someone died, Tammany covered the funeral. When someone needed a doctor, Tammany sent one. The machine took care of its people, even while robbing the city treasury. This created loyalty that wasn't based on ideology or policy. It was transactional. Tammany provided concrete benefits. In exchange, immigrants voted for Tammany candidates. The machine delivered votes reliably because it delivered benefits first. This wasn't democracy in the idealistic sense, but it was a system that worked for those involved. Tweed eventually got caught. The New York Times published exposés based on leaked financial records. Cartoonist Thomas Nast drew devastating illustrations showing Tweed as a corrupt boss squeezing the city. Public pressure forced prosecution. Tweed was convicted in 1873 and died in prison in 1878. But his fall didn't end the system. New bosses took over Tammany Hall. The corruption continued, just more carefully. Officials learned to hide their theft better, to falsify records more thoroughly, to spread bribes among more people so no single individual could betray the whole operation. At the federal level, corruption was equally pervasive. Senators were chosen by state legislatures, not direct election. This made them easier to influence. A wealthy industrialist could compensate enough legislators to install his chosen candidate. Once in the Senate, that person would protect the industrialist's interests. Railroad companies were particularly aggressive. They needed federal land grants. They needed favorable regulation. They needed subsidies. So they bought senators and representatives systematically. Bribes weren't even subtle. Railroad executives kept cash in Washington specifically for influencing lawmakers. The Credit Mobilier scandal showed how brazen it got. The company building the Union Pacific created a construction firm, Credit Mobilier, that charged inflated prices. The excess profit went to insiders. To prevent investigation, they gave shares to congressmen. When this became public in 1872, it implicated major figures. But consequences were minimal. A few lost elections. Most kept their positions. The system continued. The spoils system made everything worse. When a new party won election, they fired government employees and replaced them with supporters. Every job from postal clerk to customs inspector was awarded based on loyalty. You got hired because you supported the right candidate. You kept your job by continuing that support. Competence was irrelevant. Loyalty mattered. This meant government was incompetent. Customs inspectors who didn't understand regulations. Tax collectors who couldn't do arithmetic. Postal workers who lost mail. But they'd all supported the winning candidate, so they got positions. The cost in efficiency was enormous. But efficiency wasn't the goal. The goal was rewarding supporters and punishing opponents. Business interests loved this system. Incompetent regulators were easy to manipulate. Purchased officials stayed bought. The spoils system meant you knew exactly who to approach because they'd just been appointed. Everything was predictable. You knew the cost of favorable treatment. You made the payment. You got what you wanted. Reformers tried fighting back. They called for civil service reform, for hiring government employees based on merit, not loyalty, for ending the spoils system, for regulating railroads and breaking up monopolies. But they faced enormous opposition. The industrialists opposed reform because it threatened their advantages. Officials opposed it because corruption was profitable. Immigrant communities often opposed it because machines provided services that reformers didn't. Reform required building a coalition strong enough to overcome all these interests. Some states passed Granger laws in the 1870s. These regulated railroad rates and prevented discrimination. But railroads fought back in courts. They argued regulation violated property rights. They won often enough to make the laws ineffective. Federal regulation wouldn't come until later. The Supreme Court in this era sided with business. Judges interpreted the Constitution to protect corporate interests. They struck down laws limiting working hours. They invalidated price regulations. They protected trusts from antitrust prosecution. The judiciary became another barrier to reform. All of this created an environment where men like Carnegie and Rockefeller could operate freely. They compensated lawmakers for favorable treatment. They influenced judges to rule in their favor. They funded journalists to write positive articles. They hired strikebreakers to crush unions. Everything was for sale. This wasn't subtle conspiracy. It was open practice. Business leaders talked about it freely among themselves, how much they'd spent for particular laws, which senators were reliable, which judges could be counted on. It was just how things worked. The corruption even had defenders. Some argued it made government efficient. Instead of endless debate and uncertainty, businesses could get clear answers quickly. Compensate the right people, get what you need, move forward. From a business perspective, this was better than honest government that moved slowly. Others argued corruption was the price of rapid development. America was industrializing faster than any nation in history. That speed created wealth and jobs. If corruption greased the wheels, so be it. The results justified the methods. Besides, everyone was getting richer. What was the problem? The problem, of course, was that not everyone was getting richer. Workers earned poverty wages while industrialists accumulated millions. Immigrants lived in squalor, while officials bought mansions with illegal gains. The wealth being created was distributing upward, concentrated among fewer people every year. But in the 1880s, reformers hadn't built enough power to change the system. The machine was too entrenched, too many people benefited, too many interests aligned to prevent reform. Corruption would continue, and with it, the conditions that made Gilded Age fortunes possible. The arrangement wasn't broken. It worked exactly as designed. It transferred wealth from public coffers to private hands. It protected business interests from regulation. It prevented workers from organizing effectively. It made extreme inequality not just possible, but inevitable. And the men building fortunes understood this perfectly. They didn't just tolerate corruption, they depended on it. Their businesses required government favor. Their monopolies required protection. Their wealth required a system that prevented redistribution. So they fed the machine. They made the payments. They bought the influence. They funded the organizations. And in return, they got an America where almost anything was permitted if you were wealthy enough, where rules applied to ordinary people but not to robber barons, where democracy existed in theory but oligarchy operated in practice. This was the foundation of the Gilded Age, not just economic conditions, not just technological change, but a deliberate system of corruption that transferred power and wealth upward. That made accumulation easier for those who already had money. That ensured the rich would stay rich and get richer. The mansions would soon rise on Fifth Avenue. The balls and parties would follow. The social system would emerge. But underneath it all was this: bought influence, corrupted judges, a government for sale to the highest bidder. That's what made everything else possible. Chapter 8, 1883. The Knight Society was born. Alva Vanderbilt had a problem. She was married to one of the richest men in America, William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. Their mansion at 665th Avenue had cost over $3 million, but New York society wouldn't accept them. The Vanderbilts were new money. Wealthy, yes. But the Commodore had been a ferry boat operator, a businessman, common. Old New York families, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Stuyvesants, considered the Vanderbilts vulgar. Caroline Astor, who controlled society, had never invited Alva to her events. This enraged Alva. She hadn't married into wealth to be excluded from society. She'd built a French chateau in Manhattan. She'd imported European furniture and art. She'd done everything right. But the doors remained closed. Mrs. Astor decided who mattered, and she'd decided the Vanderbilts didn't. Alva planned her revenge carefully. She would throw a party so spectacular, so elaborate, so expensive that Mrs. Astor couldn't ignore it. A costume ball. March 26, 1883. Invitations would go to everyone who mattered. Everyone except Mrs. Astor. The planning took months. Alva hired decorators, caterers, musicians. She spent over $250,000, equivalent to over $7 million today, for one party, one night. The mansion would be transformed into a palace of excess that would force society to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. Word spread through New York. Everyone was talking about Alva's ball. What costume would they wear? Who would attend? The anticipation built for weeks. Young Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's daughter, desperately wanted to attend. She and her friends had practiced a dance specifically for the ball, but Carrie couldn't go. Her mother hadn't been invited. According to etiquette, you couldn't attend a party at someone's home unless your mother had received that person socially. Mrs. Astor had never received Alva Vanderbilt. Therefore, young Carrie was excluded. Carrie begged her mother to fix this. Mrs. Astor faced a choice: maintain her principles and disappoint her daughter, or acknowledge the Vanderbilts and gain Carrie entrance to the social event of the season. After much deliberation, she chose her daughter. Mrs. Astor had her servant deliver a calling card to Alva Vanderbilt's home. This was the traditional way of initiating social relations. By leaving her card, Mrs. Astor was acknowledging Alva's existence, accepting her as part of society. Alva responded by sending an invitation to the ball. Mrs. Astor and her daughter could now attend. This exchange changed everything. If Caroline Astor accepted the Vanderbilts, everyone else would follow. The family that had been excluded for decades was suddenly legitimate. One strategic party had accomplished what money alone couldn't. The night of the ball exceeded all expectations. 1,200 guests arrived in elaborate costumes, historical figures, mythological characters, European royalty. The costumes cost thousands of dollars each. Women wore gowns covered in jewels. Men dressed as knights in armor. The competition for most impressive outfit was fierce. Alva herself came as a Venetian princess. Her gown was covered in gold and jewels. She'd had it made in Paris specifically for this night. She stood at the entrance, receiving guests. The queen of New York society, whether the old families liked it or not. The mansion had been transformed. Thousands of roses filled every room. Orchids hung from chandeliers. Palm trees created a tropical atmosphere. The ballroom was decorated to resemble a European palace. Gas lights blazed everywhere, making the night as bright as day. The flower bill alone exceeded $10,000. Music played from the moment guests arrived, a full orchestra in the ballroom, smaller ensembles in other rooms. The dancing began around 10 and continued past midnight. Waltzes, quadrilles, the newest dances from Paris. Young Carrie Astor and her friends performed their choreographed routine to applause. At midnight, supper was served, not a sit-down dinner. A lavish buffet spread across multiple rooms, every delicacy imaginable. Oysters, caviar, lobster, pheasant, beef, lamb, dozens of dishes. Champagne flowed constantly. Guests ate standing or in small groups, then returned to dancing. The New York Times covered the ball extensively. multiple pages describing costumes, decorations, guests. The article treated it as a major cultural event, which in a sense it was. This was the moment when new money forced acceptance, when wealth alone became sufficient for social status. Other newspapers were more critical. Some viewed the excess as obscene. $250,000 on one party while workers earned dollars per week. The contrast was grotesque. But those criticisms were minority voices. Most coverage was admiring. Americans loved reading about wealth and glamour. The ball established Alva as a society leader. She became one of the women who decided who mattered. She threw regular events. She was consulted on social questions. She achieved exactly what she'd intended. The Vanderbilt name was now as good as Astor. More importantly, the ball changed the rules. Before 1883, old money controlled society completely. After, new money could buy its way in. You needed extreme wealth. You needed to display that wealth spectacularly. But it was possible. The Vanderbilts had proven it. This opened the doors for other new money families. Carnegie would eventually be accepted. Rockefeller's children would marry into society. The railroad barons, the steel magnates, the oil tycoons, all would gain social legitimacy by following Alva's template. Build a mansion, throw spectacular parties, overwhelm resistance with sheer wealth. The cost was escalation. If the Vanderbilts spent $250,000 on a ball, the next host needed to spend more. If one mansion cost $3 million, the next needed to cost $5 million. Competition drove excess upward. Each party had to exceed the previous one. Each house had to be grander. This suited the new millionaires perfectly. They had money to spend. Showing it off demonstrated their success. The elaborate social rituals gave them something to do with their wealth beyond just accumulating more. It transformed business success into cultural status. For women especially, this created opportunities. Alva Vanderbilt used social ambition to achieve real power. She couldn't run a company or control a railroad. Those were male domains. But she could dominate society. She could decide who was invited and who was excluded. That was power of a different kind, but power nonetheless. Other wealthy women followed her example. They became society leaders, they organized charity events, they patronized the arts, they built museums and opera houses. This gave them influence and purpose beyond managing households. It created a role for wealthy women in public life. The ball also established patterns for Gilded Age entertaining. Costume balls became common. Themed parties proliferated. Hosts competed on elaborateness and expense. A successful event required months of planning and tens of thousands of dollars minimum. The wealthy created a social season, fall through spring, when they entertained constantly. Newport, Rhode Island became the summer alternative. Wealthy families built cottages, actually enormous mansions, along the coast. The season moved to Newport in July and August. The same people, the same parties, just in a different location. The calendar of social obligations filled the entire year. But this system was fragile. It required that everyone agree these events mattered. That being invited was important. That exclusion was devastating. As long as the wealthy cared deeply about social status, the system worked. But if they stopped caring, if they decided elaborate balls were silly, the whole structure would collapse. In 1883, that collapse seemed impossible. The Gilded Age was just beginning. The fortunes were still growing. The mansions were still being built. The social system was crystallizing. Alva Vanderbilt's ball wasn't just a party. It was the moment when economic power transformed into social power. When new money became old money. When the Gilded Age truly began. The dancing that night lasted until dawn. Guests left exhausted but exhilarated. They'd witnessed something significant. The birth of a new social order. One where wealth, properly displayed, could overcome any obstacle. Where money bought not just comfort, but status. Where the robber barons and their families became American aristocracy. Mrs. Astor had lost. Not immediately. She'd remain influential for years. But she'd conceded the principle. She'd acknowledged the Vanderbilts. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed. New money would keep arriving. Keep building bigger mansions. Keep throwing grander parties. Until the whole system collapsed under its own weight. But that was decades away. For now, on that March night in 1883, the Gilded Age reached its social crystallization. The economic foundation had been laid. The fortunes had been built. And now, finally, the wealthy had a system for displaying their success. For competing with each other. For excluding those beneath them. Society was born. Chapter 9. Building the Palaces. Fifth Avenue in 1880 looked different from just a decade before. Where empty lots had stood, limestone mansions now rose, block after block, each grander than the last. The wealthy were building monuments to themselves, and they were doing it as quickly as possible. Richard Morris Hunt was the architect everyone wanted. The first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he understood European architecture intimately. More importantly, he understood his clients. They wanted houses that announced wealth from blocks away. Hunt delivered. His design for William K. Vanderbilt's mansion set the standard. Completed in 1882, just before Alva's famous ball, it was French Gothic. Gray limestone, steep roofs, carved ornament covering every surface, turrets, balconies, gargoyles. It looked like it had been transported from the Loire Valley and dropped onto Fifth Avenue. The interior was even more elaborate. A great hall rose 3 stories. Carved oak paneling imported from a French chateau covered the walls. Stained glass windows filtered colored light. A grand staircase curved upward, wide enough for a dozen people to ascend side by side. Every room competed to outdo the others in marble, gold leaf, and artistic detail. The cost was staggering. $3 million for construction, another $2 million for furnishings and decoration, $5 million total, equivalent to over $150 million today. For one house, one family's residence in a city where workers earned $10 weekly. But the Vanderbilts weren't alone. Once their chateau was complete, competitors rushed to build their own. Carnegie commissioned a mansion between 90th and 91st Streets. Andrew and Louise Whitfield Carnegie wanted something substantial but not ostentatious. Their house still cost over $1 million and occupied an entire block front. Henry Clay Frick built at 70th Street. His mansion was designed from the start to eventually become a museum. He was already collecting old master paintings and wanted a house that displayed them properly. Large galleries, perfect lighting, classical proportions. The building opened in 1914, bridging the Gilded Age and the modern era. The Astor family built multiple residences. Caroline Astor's house at 840 Fifth Avenue was relatively modest by later standards. But her relatives built larger. The family owned property up and down the avenue. Astor money, made in Manhattan real estate generations earlier, now bought more Manhattan real estate that increased in value, generating more money to buy more property. The competition wasn't just between families, it was between generations within families. William Henry Vanderbilt built a massive brownstone complex at 51st Street. His sons looked at it and decided they needed something grander. So they built French Chateau. Then William K. Vanderbilt's brothers built even larger houses. Each generation tried to exceed the previous one. Senator William Andrews Clark, who'd made a fortune in Montana copper, built perhaps the most excessive residence of all. 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, multiple ballrooms. 7 years to complete, finishing in 1911. It cost $7 million. Critics called it vulgar. Clark didn't care. He had money and wanted everyone to know it. Construction of these palaces wasn't quick. 2 to 4 years was typical. Massive stone blocks were quarried and carved. Skilled craftsmen worked for months on single decorative elements. Marble was imported from Italy. Wood paneling came from France. Every detail required time and labor. The disruption to neighborhoods was enormous. Noise from construction, wagons delivering materials, dust, debris. But nobody complained loudly. Everyone on Fifth Avenue was either building or planning to build. The inconvenience was mutual. The houses competed in every detail. Whose ballroom was largest? Whose staircase was most impressive? whose art collection was most valuable. The wealthy gave tours to favored guests, showing off their acquisitions. Each mansion became a museum displaying its owner's taste and wealth. The technical requirements were substantial. These weren't simple structures. They needed modern plumbing, electrical systems for lighting, central heating that could warm dozens of rooms, servants' quarters for 30 to 50 staff, kitchens that could produce formal dinners for hundreds. All this had to be integrated into buildings designed to look medieval or Renaissance. Hunt and other architects solved these problems by hiding modernity behind historical facades. Steel beams supported stone walls. Modern plumbing ran through medieval-looking spaces. Electrical wiring was concealed in walls. The buildings looked centuries old but functioned with 19th century technology. The servant requirements shaped the architecture significantly. Top floors held staff quarters. Separate staircases let servants move through the house without being seen by family or guests. Service areas, kitchens, laundries, storage, occupied basements and ground floors. The grand public rooms were on the main floors, separate from the working spaces that made them function. This created houses that were really two buildings in one, the elegant spaces the family and guests saw, and the utilitarian spaces where servants worked. They coexisted but rarely intersected. The system required careful design to ensure servants could do their jobs while remaining invisible. The cost extended beyond construction. Property taxes climbed as the city assessed these palaces at their true value. Heating bills in winter were enormous. Dozens of fireplaces plus early central heating systems burning coal by the ton. Insurance was expensive. Maintenance was constant. Roofs leaked. Stone cracked. Interior decoration required updating every few years to stay fashionable. But for 2 decades, roughly 1885 to 1905, the building continued. More mansions, larger mansions, more elaborate mansions. Fifth Avenue became a canyon of wealth. Walking up the avenue meant passing palace after palace, each announcing its owner's fortune. The concentration of wealth in such a small area was unprecedented. Within 20 blocks lived families worth hundreds of millions collectively. They attended the same parties. Their children married each other. They sat on the same corporate boards. They shaped American business and finance from their Fifth Avenue drawing rooms. The street became a tourist attraction. Middle-class families would walk or take streetcars up Fifth Avenue on Sundays just to look at the houses. The sidewalks filled with people staring at residences they could never afford. The wealthy residents sometimes resented the intrusion but couldn't prevent it. These were private homes on public streets. Architects like Hunt became wealthy themselves. Designing houses for millionaires paid well. Hunt could command fees of 10% of construction costs. On a $3 million house, that was $300,000. His practice thrived on wealthy clients competing to build more impressive residences. The building boom also employed thousands of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, decorators, furniture makers. The construction created jobs even as it displayed extreme inequality. Workers who earned poverty wages built palaces for families who would never notice them. And the whole display rested on a belief that seemed unshakable, that wealth would continue growing, that these houses would stand for generations, that the social system they represented was permanent. The families building these mansions in the 1890s assumed their great-grandchildren would live in them, that the Gilded Age would last forever. They couldn't imagine that within 30 years, most of these houses would be demolished, that economic and social changes would make them unsustainable, that the mansions themselves would become monuments to a vanished era rather than permanent residences. But in the 1880s and 90s, demolition seemed impossible. The houses were being built. Fifth Avenue was transforming, and the physical manifestation of Gilded Age wealth was reaching its peak. The industrial fortunes had been made. The social system had crystallized. Now the architecture reflected the power and wealth concentrated in a few hands. The palaces stood as proof that extreme wealth was real, that it could be displayed, that it commanded respect and admiration. Each mansion was a statement. We made this money. We built this house. We matter. And for a while they were right. Chapter 10. The machine runs itself. By 1890, the system was self-perpetuating. No one needed to maintain it consciously anymore. It simply ran. The mechanisms were in place. The incentives aligned. The wealthy got wealthier automatically. The monopolies controlled their industries completely. Standard Oil refined 90% of American oil. Carnegie Steel produced more than Britain. The railroads had divided territory among themselves, eliminating competition. These weren't businesses anymore. They were machines for extracting wealth from the American economy. And extraction was effortless. When you control an industry, you set prices. Rockefeller could charge whatever he wanted for kerosene. Customers had no alternative. Carnegie could set steel prices high enough to maximize profit. Railroads could charge farmers and businesses whatever rates they chose. The lack of competition meant the lack of constraints. The profits accumulated faster than anyone could spend them. Carnegie's personal income in a good year exceeded $20 million. Rockefeller's exceeded that. The Vanderbilt family collectively earned tens of millions annually from their railroad holdings. This was in an era when $500 was a decent annual wage for a worker. The wealth concentration accelerated without intervention. Rich men invested profits in more businesses. Those businesses generated more profits, which got reinvested. The compounding was exponential. A fortune of $10 million in 1870 could become $50 million by 1890 without the owner doing anything except investing wisely. This created a permanent aristocracy, not based on land or titles like European nobility, based on capital. And capital reproduced itself through investment returns. The children of robber barons inherited fortunes that generated income without work. They could live lavishly their entire lives without ever earning a dollar. The political system protected this arrangement. Senators and representatives stayed bought. They blocked regulations that might constrain business. They approved subsidies and land grants that increased corporate profits. They appointed judges who ruled in favor of wealth. The corruption wasn't an aberration. It was the system functioning as designed. Courts reinforced business power systematically. They struck down laws limiting working hours. They invalidated price regulations. They issued injunctions against strikes. They interpreted the Constitution to protect property rights over human rights. The judiciary became a fortress defending concentrated wealth from any challenge. The tax system aided accumulation. No federal income tax existed. No inheritance tax. State and local taxes fell heavily on property and consumption, which hurt the poor proportionally more than the rich. The wealthy paid almost nothing compared to their income and wealth. This let fortunes grow undiminished across generations. Immigration continued providing cheap labor. The flow never stopped. Millions arrived every decade. They competed for jobs, keeping wages low. When workers tried organizing, employers could replace them with new immigrants willing to work for less. The labor surplus was permanent. Technology increased productivity without increasing wages. Better machinery meant workers produced more per hour, but the additional value went to owners, not workers. A steel mill in 1890 produced far more than one in 1870, but workers' wages hadn't risen proportionally. The productivity gains became profit. The social system legitimized inequality. Mrs. Astor's 400, the elaborate balls, the Newport season. This created a culture where extreme wealth was celebrated, not questioned. The wealthy were society leaders, tastemakers, the people everyone wanted to emulate. Inequality seemed natural rather than constructed. Education reinforced class divisions. The wealthy sent children to private schools and European universities. They received classical educations and made connections with other wealthy families. Poor children, if they attended school at all, got basic literacy and were pushed into work by age 12 or 13. Social mobility existed in theory, but rarely in practice. Marriage patterns concentrated wealth further. Wealthy families married within their class. Vanderbilts married Astors, Carnegies married into established families. These marriages combined fortunes and strengthened economic positions. Occasionally, a wealthy man married a poor woman, but wealthy women almost never married down. Capital flowed upward through marriage as through everything else. The media largely supported the system. Newspapers were owned by wealthy men. They published favorable coverage of business leaders. They portrayed strikes as lawless. They praised philanthropy while ignoring how fortunes were made. Alternative voices existed but reached smaller audiences. The dominant narrative celebrated wealth. Religion provided spiritual justification. Protestant churches preached that wealth was a sign of God's favor, that poverty resulted from moral failure. The gospel of wealth, articulated by Carnegie, argued that rich men had a duty to give away their fortunes. But first they had to accumulate them through ruthless business practices. The contradiction didn't trouble many people. Even critics often accepted the system's basic premises. Labor leaders wanted better wages and conditions, but not fundamental restructuring. Reformers wanted to limit monopoly power, but not eliminate private ownership. Socialists existed but remained marginal. The mainstream debate was about modifying the system, not replacing it. International comparisons didn't provoke change. European nations had some regulations America lacked, but American businesses were more productive. American wealth was growing faster. American workers earned more than European workers, even if far less than American owners. The system seemed to be working, at least compared to alternatives. The sheer scale of wealth was difficult to comprehend. When Carnegie sold his steel company in 1901 for $480 million, his personal share was $225 million. This was more money than most people could conceptualize. It created a psychological distance. Carnegie wasn't just rich. He existed in a different category entirely. This incomprehensible wealth made resistance seem futile. How do you fight someone with $200 million? They could hire armies of lawyers. They could buy politicians. They could wait out any strike or boycott. The power imbalance was so extreme that challenges seemed pointless. The wealthy themselves believed their success was deserved. They'd worked hard. They'd been clever. They'd taken risks. That they'd also bribed officials, crushed competitors, and exploited workers didn't diminish their sense of accomplishment. They'd played by the rules, or rather, made the rules, and won. Success proved merit. Their children absorbed this worldview, growing up in mansions, attended by servants, educated at the finest institutions. They believed their privilege was natural, that their families deserved wealth because their ancestors had earned it, that the social hierarchy reflected genuine differences in capability and worth. The geographic concentration intensified the bubble. In Newport or on Fifth Avenue, everyone was wealthy. You socialized only with other rich families. Your frame of reference was other mansions and yachts. You could believe everyone lived comfortably because everyone you knew did. The poverty that made your wealth possible was invisible. This created an echo chamber where criticism never penetrated. The wealthy surrounded themselves with people who affirmed their worldview. Their lawyers, their servants, their social peers, all had incentives to agree. No one told them their system was unjust because no one around them thought it was. But cracks were forming. Labor unrest was increasing. Strike frequency rose. Some strikes turned violent. The Haymarket bombing in 1886, the Homestead strike in 1892, the Pullman strike in 1894. Each incident showed working-class anger was growing. Muckraking journalists were beginning to investigate. Ida Tarbell would soon expose Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair would reveal meatpacking industry horrors. Lincoln Steffens would document urban corruption. These investigations would reach mass audiences and shift public opinion. Progressive politicians were emerging. They talked about regulation, about breaking up trusts, about protecting workers. They were still minority voices in 1890, but they were growing louder, building coalitions, preparing challenges to the system, and international events would soon intervene. The Spanish-American War in 1898, then, eventually, World War I. These conflicts would change America in ways no one in 1890 could anticipate. They would require government power on scales that would make business regulation seem reasonable by comparison. But in 1890, none of this was visible yet. The machine ran smoothly. The fortunes grew, the mansions rose, the parties continued. The Gilded Age was at its peak, and it seemed like it would last forever. That's what made the eventual collapse so shocking. The system seemed invincible right up until it wasn't. Chapter 11, 1893, The Peak Before the Storm. Chicago in 1893 was transforming. The World's Columbian Exposition was opening. 400 acres along Lake Michigan had been converted into the White City, gleaming neoclassical buildings that looked like ancient Rome rebuilt in modern America. 27 million people would visit over 6 months. It was America showing the world what it had become. The exposition celebrated 400 years since Columbus reached America. But really, it celebrated American industrial power. The exhibits showcased American technology, steel production, railroad systems, electrical lighting, manufacturing prowess. Everything that had made Gilded Age fortunes possible was on display. The White City itself was a marvel. Designed by architect Daniel Burnham, it featured grand buildings arranged around lagoons and canals. Everything was painted white, creating a unified aesthetic. At night, electric lights illuminated the entire complex. Most Americans had never seen electric lighting on such a scale. It was literally dazzling. The exposition had exhibits from every American industry. Carnegie Steel had a display showing production processes. Westinghouse demonstrated electrical systems. The railroads showcased their networks. Every major corporation wanted presence at this showcase of American achievement. George Ferris built the first Ferris wheel specifically for the exposition, 264 feet tall, carrying over 2,000 passengers at once. It was engineering spectacle, a demonstration that American ingenuity could create anything. Visitors lined up for hours to ride it. The Midway featured entertainment from around the world, exhibits showing different cultures, music and dance performances. It was part educational, part carnival. But underlying everything was a message. America had arrived. It was modern, powerful, ready to take its place among the great nations. The wealthy attended in large numbers. They came from New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They toured the exhibits. They attended receptions. They saw America's industrial might displayed proudly. For them, the exposition validated everything they'd built. This was the result of their enterprise, their vision, their fortunes. But while Chicago celebrated, economic trouble was building. The Panic of 1893 started in May, just as the exposition opened. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. Within weeks, other railroads followed. Banks began failing. The stock market crashed. By summer, the country was entering another depression. The timing was darkly ironic. Chicago was celebrating American prosperity while the economy collapsed. Visitors to the White City returned home to find banks closed and jobs disappearing. The contrast between the exposition's gleaming optimism and the Depression's grim reality was stark. This panic was worse than 1873. More banks failed. More businesses closed. Unemployment reached 20% in some cities. The Depression would last 4 years. It showed that despite all the wealth at the top, the American economy remained fragile and vulnerable. The causes were complex. Overexpansion of railroads, bank speculation, international gold flows. But fundamentally, the economy had built too much capacity relative to actual demand. Railroads had laid track to places that generated little traffic. Factories produced more than consumers could buy. The bubble had to burst eventually. For ordinary Americans, the Depression was catastrophic. Jobs disappeared, savings were lost, families that had been stable fell into poverty. Coxey's Army, a protest march of unemployed workers, walked to Washington in 1894 demanding government jobs programs. They were arrested when they arrived. The wealthy suffered less. Their fortunes declined in value. Their investments lost money, but they weren't destitute. A $10 million fortune that dropped to $6 million was still $6 million, enough to live comfortably. The Depression was inconvenient for the rich. For workers, it was catastrophic. Labor unrest intensified. The Pullman strike in 1894 paralyzed rail traffic nationwide. Federal troops intervened to break it. Violence erupted. The Depression exposed the class tensions that prosperity had masked. When times were good, workers endured low wages. When times were bad, they fought back. The Depression also revealed how dependent the wealthy were on the system functioning. Their fortunes existed mostly on paper. Stock values, property assessments, business valuations. When the economy crashed, paper wealth evaporated. The steel magnates and railroad barons discovered they controlled assets that couldn't be easily converted to cash during crisis. Some of the wealthy adapted. They bought assets at Depression prices, positioning themselves for recovery. Carnegie acquired more steel facilities. Rockefeller expanded Standard Oil's reach. The pattern from 1873 repeated. Strong firms with capital used crisis to grow stronger. But the Depression shook confidence. The assumption that American prosperity would continue indefinitely was challenged. If the economy could crash this badly at the peak of American power, showcased in Chicago, what did that say about the system's stability? Reform movements gained momentum. The Depression created political will for change that prosperity had prevented. People demanded regulation of railroads, control of trusts, protection for workers. The wealthy resisted, but their political power wasn't absolute. Public anger was rising. The exposition closed in October 1893. The White City was dismantled. The buildings were temporary, designed to last only for the exhibition. Within months, most were gone. The whole spectacular display vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. The symbolism was hard to miss. By 1897, the economy was recovering. Growth resumed. Unemployment fell. The wealthy rebuilt their fortunes. Carnegie would soon sell his steel company for nearly $500 million. Rockefeller's Standard Oil would reach its peak power. The Gilded Age continued, but something had shifted. The 1890s Depression showed the system's vulnerabilities. It demonstrated that extreme inequality created instability. It proved that concentration of wealth in few hands made the economy fragile. These lessons weren't immediately acted on, but they were learned. The exposition had represented peak confidence, America displaying its achievements, the wealthy celebrating their success, the system at its most impressive. But underneath, the contradictions were growing. The inequality, the exploitation, the instability. The factors that would eventually destroy the Gilded Age were present, even if not yet visible to most people. Looking back, 1893 was the hinge point. Before it, the Gilded Age seemed permanent and invincible. After it, cracks appeared, not enough to bring immediate collapse, but enough to show that the system wasn't eternal. That forces were building that would eventually dismantle everything the robber barons had built. The wealthy attending the Chicago Exposition couldn't see this. They saw American triumph, industrial might, cultural achievement. They believed their world would last, that their children and grandchildren would inherit it intact. They were building mansions designed to stand for centuries. They couldn't imagine that within 30 years, many of those mansions would be demolished, that income taxes would claim much of their fortunes, that regulations would constrain their businesses, that labor would organize successfully, that World War I would reshape everything, that the Gilded Age would end. But in 1893, standing in the White City, looking at the electric lights reflecting off white buildings, watching the Ferris wheel turn, that future was invisible. The present seemed glorious. The past, the decades of building, accumulating, consolidating, seemed to point toward an even more magnificent future. They were wrong, but they couldn't know that yet. The Gilded Age had reached its peak. The machine was running perfectly. The system seemed invincible. Everything they'd built seemed permanent. And that's always when things are most fragile. When success seems most complete. When confidence is highest. That's when the forces of change are gathering. When the seeds of destruction that were planted during the rise finally begin to sprout. The Gilded Age had started with opportunity, the end of a war, the completion of a railroad, the absence of regulation. It had grown through exploitation, of workers, of resources, of political systems. It had peaked with spectacular displays of wealth and power. And now, standing at the Chicago Exposition in 1893, it had reached the moment just before the beginning of the end. The storm was coming, but the sky still looked clear.